The way I kind of break paleo down is that it's about kind of macronutrient quality, and it's kind of macronutrient agnostic. Maybe it's high carb, maybe it's low carb, maybe it's high protein, maybe it's low protein, but it puts on kind of a perspective of a view of our kind of ancestry and how recently have different food stuffs entered our day-to-day experience.
Hey everybody, Dr. Josh Axe here, and on today's podcast, we have one of the people that's really helped pioneer the paleo diet, the keto diet, and so much more. It is Robb Wolf. Robb, welcome to the show.
Doc, huge honor to be on the show. Thanks.
Well, cool. I know we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. We'll talk keto, we'll talk paleo. We're going to talk about the brain. We're also going to even, talk a little bit about, sort of our health message and really what makes you so unique and what you talk about. And I know your wife, I've seen some of her work and that type of thing as well in the whole paleo space. But I'd love to start off just hearing a little bit about your story. Why is it, like, what's your mission? And because I know you have a new podcast out, or a podcast that's awesome. It's called The Healthy Rebellion Radio. Mm-hmm. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But really, what got you in the natural health space? What's your mission today? And then let's jump into keto, paleo, and everything else.
Yeah. And I'll try to be succinct. It's a long story at this point, but I've always been interested in health and human performance. I did a biochemistry undergrad. I was kind of debating between medical school, naturopathy school, Chinese medicine, I was really, or just doing like a PhD deal, because I do enjoy research. I was actually doing some bench chemistry research at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, doing some lipid metabolism related work. And it was right around this time I had a really significant health crisis. I developed ulcerative colitis so bad that they wanted to do all manner of surgery on me. And I was the ripe old age of about 26, 27. And I was sufficiently well steeped in medical practices that I knew that was not a good option. Yeah. And so I was vegan at the time. We discovered that my mother had celiac disease. I had celiac disease. I'm intolerant to most grains, legumes, and dairy. Can have a little bit of stuff here and there, but it was the discovery that of these kind of food intolerances that got me directed towards the concept of what we would now call a paleo type diet. I ended up tracking down Loren Cordain back in 2000, 2001 and doing a research fellowship with him.
Well, can I say quick too?
Oh, yeah.
So the way I got turned on to you, Robb, was I read a book called The Paleo Diet for Athletes. Mm-hmm. And it was a fantastic book. So I was a big triathlete at the time, and read the book, was so impressed, started following it, and really saw great results. My joints felt great, gut felt great. But I'll let you go on. I just wanted to say that's when I first had heard your name, was reading that book.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so did some work with Loren, and right around that time, I was always, poking around in the early interwebs, and I found this new workout called CrossFit. And a friend of mine who's a retired Navy SEAL, he and I started doing this stuff in his garage each morning. And probably within about 3 months, we had like 30 people that we were training there. And so we reached out to Greg and Lauren Glassman, the founders of CrossFit, and we said, hey, we would like to open a gym and call it CrossFit. And they said, we would love that. And that ended up being the first CrossFit affiliate gym in the world. And
wow.
This was up in Seattle. And then I moved down to Chico, California, where I did my undergrad. I kind of missed the sun compared to Seattle. And so I opened up what was then CrossFit NorCal, which was the fourth CrossFit affiliate gym in the world. So I was just super early in like the kind of paleo CrossFit scene. If you do like a Google Trends analysis of paleo and CrossFit, they grew and they lived and died in lockstep with each other. But it was a really interesting opportunity to work with people from elite athletes, soldiers, SEALs, to the area that my heart really resonates, which is more that metabolic syndrome and gut and autoimmunity related stuff. Like, it's super cool to work with high-level athletes, but I kind of feel like I'm more of a speed bump than anything else. I just try to slow them down so they don't kill themselves. And that's not that gratifying. Whereas I felt like, somebody suffering metabolic syndrome or a really severe autoimmune disease, if I could help that person, it might literally save their life.
Yes.
And so that's really been kind of my orienting, I guess, North Star is just trying to let people know that there might be some alternatives for gut and autoimmune related issues in particular that aren't really well steeped within the mainstream. And my first book, The Paleo Solution, was the first time that the term autoimmune paleo diet was, formalized and written down. And then, 10 years after that, we have quite a number of randomized controlled trials now. And like Terry Wall's just got a $2 million research allocation to really dig into the autoimmune paleo diet and different iterations of it. So even though it started off pretty pseudo-scientific out there in the weeds, like it's over time, it's really gained a ton of traction. And I think you mentioned keto a little bit earlier on. I think keto is going to prove to be a more amenable topic for research because it's got this really binary cut point. Are you in or are you out? Whereas paleo is really likable. Is it high carb or is it low carb? Is it high protein or low protein? Like there's all these variations to it. And so although research continues to go forward on just kind of the paleo diet concept, I think that kind of low carb and or ketogenic perspective it just lends itself better to academic research. It just kind of fits within that model better.
Yeah, I agree, and I can totally see that. And we've seen in a short period of time how many keto studies are coming out.
Exploded. Yeah,
it is, and so it's so I can totally see that. For the listeners, I'd love for you to share really what are the benefits of the paleo diet. What is it exactly? What are the benefits of keto, and which diet is best for which type of person in your professional opinion?
Oh man, the way I kind of break paleo down is that it's about kind of macronutrient quality, and it's kind of macronutrient agnostic. Maybe it's high carb, maybe it's low carb, maybe it's high protein, maybe it's low protein, but it puts on kind of a perspective of a view of our kind of ancestry and how recently have different foodstuffs entered our day-to-day experience. And so we have like this industrialization process, which is only about 30 years old, 40 years old of the really intensified industrial food system. Prior to that, we had this run-up of what we would call, the agricultural revolution. But then all of human history prior to that was spent as hunter-gatherers. And so within that hunting and gathering story, you had different types of fish and game meat, fruits, vegetables, root shoots and tubers, and some sort of seasonal variation to that. Like sometimes things were really in abundance and sometimes there was kind of a relative scarcity. And so I think that, we can imply some things from that are probably an optimal diet is largely whole unprocessed foods. There's probably as much variability within that as what we can kind of reasonably tolerate. And some people today have less tolerance than maybe what we should, but I'm at a loss as to how to recover that, like things like oxalate and histamine intolerances. Why are those emerging? Because of changes in the gut microbiome. But that paleo template is the food, but it's also an acknowledgement of community, of photo period exposure. Like I really would ring the bell both on the gut microbiome and the circadian biology. The interest in the paleo diet really drove interest in those topics too. Those were important topics. They would have emerged eventually, but I really feel like the kind of paleo concept put an enormous amount of focus on those. And then I guess the flip side is a ketogenic diet historically has been oriented around an intervention for epileptic seizures specifically. That's when it was originally developed. It was a very high fat, low to moderate protein, very low carbohydrate diet. And it was great in a lot of ways, but it presented some challenges. Children had a tendency of failure to thrive. They didn't get as tall as their peers that ate a mixed diet. It's pretty difficult to stay on. And over the course of time, there have been a lot of iterations around that central theme, like a modified Atkins, which is higher in protein, not quite as restrictive in carbohydrate. It includes more fruits and vegetables. And then some modifications like the MCT ketogenic diet, where you eat a low glycemic load diet, again, ideally largely whole unprocessed foods, but then supplementing with various MCT sources to boost the ketogenic state from that substrate of using medium chain triglycerides, which the only fate that they can have is to be processed by the liver and converted into ketone bodies. And so over the course of time, we've found that even in these really extreme medical scenarios of like refractory epilepsy, that these modified Atkins type approaches and or the inclusion of MCTs allow for much broader kind of dietary experience, but still provides the same therapeutic benefit. So, I've eaten pretty close to a ketogenic diet for about 22 years. That's just where I feel best. If folks have read my first book, even though it was a paleo prescription, I was recommending 50 or fewer grams of carbohydrate in the beginning of this 30-day reset. So that's always been kind of my home base. And I use that as a reset to then see, do you have dairy intolerances? Do you have gluten intolerance? What's your carbohydrate tolerance? That was more the topic of my second book, Wired to Eat, where we actually got in and looked at how people respond to different amounts and types of carbohydrate. And what we find is that a lot of people don't do particularly well with many carbohydrates. And so they end up in that kind of quasi-ketogenic state as kind of their safe space for maintaining blood sugar control and really, maybe most importantly, maintaining appetite control so that they, spontaneously can moderate their eating in a way that they can remain healthy over the long haul.
Makes sense. One of the things too, I think that's interesting, and I've worked with a lot of patients in the past and people today with keto, and some people respond amazingly well. It's like, you should be on this the rest of your life. Some people though, I think, if you look at the way that some of these researchers at Johns Hopkins had people do it, it was sort of like, hey, let's try fasting. You can't fast forever. Let's go to keto. But I think for some people, what I found is doing keto is great for a lot of people. Maybe is like you would do a fast or a cleanse. You're doing it for a month, a couple times a year. Then the rest of the year, moving into something like paleo or something like that. That seems to me to work for a significant amount of people, which is one of the things that I think is so great about your work, is you've really covered both keto and then moving into something like paleo in a really powerful way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I'm a huge fan of a book. It's fairly old now. It came out in 2000, 2001 called Lights Out, Sleep, Sugar, and Survival. And they recommend a ketogenic diet, basically like fall through early spring, kind of emulating like more of a carbohydrate scarcity. And then they generally recommend try not to go too crazy with refined food, but with, opening things up and having much more latitude the rest of the year. And I think some eye towards seasonal eating makes a ton of sense, and just provides different opportunities for exploring different foods. We tend to potentially reduce the likelihood of developing food intolerances because we're not eating exactly the same thing all the time. And I think metabolically, it kind of makes sense to emulate that fasting state at least some part of the year.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. My biggest area of study has been traditional Chinese medicine. And so for me, seasonal eating is such a huge part of that. And, eating based on your internal needs. But as you're saying, there are certain foods they tend to have based on the 5 elements. But, in the winter months, you're eating foods that are very umami, things like horseradish, things that cause your body to move because you're not moving much itself, or
right.
You're not moving as much. Spring, it's let's get that liver cleansed and cleared. And so anyways, I love that train of thought. Seasonal eating is something, it never seems to be like a real popular topic, but it probably is one of the most important things we could all ever follow.
Right.
Which I know you're in alignment with. So, all right, let's talk about a few other things. So I want to talk about supplements for a minute. What do you personally use? What do you personally recommend? And are there any specific recommendations for supplements that are unique to somebody who is on keto?
Oh, man. I don't do a ton. Like this time of year when we're in the winter, I'll do a vitamin D and K combo drop. And myself, the kids, the wife, the cat, the dog, like everybody's on that. Beyond that, and getting to specifically to your question, and this is a funny thing. So I'm a biochemist by training. I'm reasonably good at it. Like I taught medical students biochemistry. And so you would think I'm reasonably good at this stuff, but for years, while I was trying to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu while keto fueled, I had a lot of problems. Like I just didn't have a low gear. It felt like I needed more carbohydrate to make things work. And so I started working with a couple of people who've become very good friends and business partners, Luis Villasenor and Tyler Cartwright of Keto Games. Those guys just do amazing work, and they're very clinically oriented. Like they just move a lot of people through this process. And when they looked at what I was doing, they said, man, you need a lot more sodium. You need more electrolytes, but more sodium in particular. And so like what anybody does when their coach tells them to do something, I ignored them because that's what everybody does, and it took a good year of them saying, you need more salt, you need more sodium, you need more sodium. And finally, one day, I really weighed and measured not just my food, but my electrolyte intake. And I found that they were recommending a minimum of 5 grams of sodium a day. I was barely getting 2 grams of sodium a day. So I bumped my sodium intake up to 6 grams a day, and it was literally a light switch was flipped, which the analogy is sound because our sodium potassium pumps are what drive our nerve impulses and muscular impulses. And if you want to have somebody die rapidly, like just disorder their electrolyte balance, or the pH is maybe the only thing that will do you in faster than that. So sodium is a huge deal, and we ended up developing a product called Element, LMNT, and drinkelement.com is where we hawk that stuff, and it's gone really well. Like it plugs the gap of a ketogenic diet. It provides a gram of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium, and it really fills in the gaps on a ketogenic diet pretty nicely. Even within ACSM guidelines, American Council of Sports Medicine guidelines, for athletic populations that are either highly active or in hot or humid environments, they recommend 7 to 10 grams of sodium a day.
Well, and so I can imagine how big a deal this is for CrossFitters.
Yeah,
especially, I mean, the number of CrossFitters now who are paleo and some keto while training, this is a huge deal. I've had this issue myself. I tend to sweat a lot when I was doing triathlons. It was hard for me to get enough sodium, because my hands are always looking pruning. I'm like, I'm not swimming. Like, why? Why is that?
Which is a sign of excess potassium and inadequate sodium. Yeah. So we get very focused on, like when people start cramping and stuff, they focus on potassium, eat a banana, eat an avocado, but it's actually the sodium that's the problem. Like it's kind of a morbid thing, but lethal injections are actually a highly concentrated form of potassium. And what it does is it causes the heart to cramp one last time, and then that's it. And so part of the contract relax cycle is actually the balance of sodium and potassium. And if we get out of whack with the sodium in particular, the forgiveness that our physiology has is much broader with overconsumption of sodium than it is overconsumption of potassium. Overconsuming potassium will do you in much more rapidly than overconsumption of sodium. And in the last 20, 30 years, what's the one recommendation that seemingly everybody agrees on? Drink more water. Okay, that sounds good, but if you're already kind of electrolyte deficient and you're just pounding more water, you're actually worsening your hydration state. Ironically, if you look in Guyton's Physiology, which Guyton is a super popular first-year medical school physiology textbook, there's probably one right there, Guyton's textbook of medical physiology. There we go. So when you look up hydration, what gets missed is there's water and electrolytes. But somewhere along the way within dietetics and medicine at large, we forgot the electrolytes and only focused on the water. And, every year, every triathlon, marathon, boot camp, people get sick and or die from hyperhydration, from over consuming water without adequate electrolytes to kind of support that. And if you look in the medical literature, it is virtually impossible to find somebody that willingly dies of dehydration. Like it does not happen. But people overhydrate or overconsume water very frequently. And so and this is stuff that sounds even crazier than suggesting that maybe saturated fat won't kill you. Like the sodium somehow got even more demonized than saturated fat and cholesterol did. And there's maybe good reason for it, because processed foods, such a central feature of the processing is additional sodium. But you really have to decouple the sodium content from everything else that's in that to really get a full accounting.
Well, I mean, it's such a good point too. And this is where I think it's so important that people understand that, again, everybody is a unique individual. And, what's happened is we've taken somebody who is a couch potato with high blood pressure and said, don't consume sodium, but nobody, or consume less sodium. And it's been a blanket statement for professional athletes, CrossFitters, triathletes, and these people that actually need more. And
right.
So anyways, it's such a good point. And so again, one of the takeaways for everybody is hydration's not just H2O, it's H2O plus electrolytes. And
yes.
it's an important thing to remember.
And possibly a vigorous leaning towards sodium relative to the other stuff too, which again is hard for folks to hear initially. Yeah.
That's great. All right. So one of the other things that I wanted to ask you about, I'd love to hear more about this. And I've seen you sort of mention this, neuroregulation of appetite. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, what's a big goal in the modern world, or maybe a different way to look at this is how many people are successful when they do dietary change? Hardly any of them.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, like being honest, it's like trying to find, unicorns or leprechauns. Like it doesn't happen very often, unfortunately. And and I know I'm kind of spazzing out here. I'm thinking like 50 different things, but there's a group of people that I'll kind of characterize in the evidence-based nutrition scene that say it's just calories in, just calories out. You just need to weigh and measure your food and everything's going to be okay. And they will cite things like metabolic ward studies where they basically lock people in the equivalent of like prison, and they weigh and measure all their food. They weigh and measure their poo and their pee and what they breathe. And under those circumstances, calories in, calories out works. Like it kind of is verified. But virtually nobody lives that way. We live in this environment where if you go as a broke college student, when I went into a 7-Eleven, there were more food options available to me than any pharaoh of Egypt, king of England, up until like 20 years ago, And this variety of food that's available has been engineered to be what we would call hyperpalatable, to be able to eat more than what would be normal. And I have a link somewhere on my website. I'll forward it to you. It's pretty interesting. There's a guy, Adam Rickman. He had a show, Man versus Food. And he would do these eating challenges. And one of his challenges was to eat the kitchen sink ice cream sundae. And literally they brought out like an 8-pound ice cream sundae, and it was in a kitchen sink, and the guy started eating it, and he got maybe a third of the way in, and you'd see him just kind of visibly turn green. And each bite he took, he started almost gagging. And what we have woven into us is a tendency for us to avoid over-consuming any one of things. So they call it a sensory-specific satiety. So even though a hot fudge sundae tastes amazing, a lot of hot fudge sundae at some point is going to taste terrible. And what's interesting is within these food competition circles, they have food pairings that allow you to eat more food overall. So this guy, his goal was to finish this ice cream sundae within a certain time allotment. He was bogging down, and what he did to win this thing was he ordered a plate of extra salty, extra crunchy French fries. So the French fries are that salt, the heat, the umami, which is as diametrically different than the cold, sweet, mouthfeel of the ice cream. And it was an enormous pile of French fries. I mean, it was probably 2,000 calories of French fries. But he succeeded in winning this thing, which I don't know what he won, if it was like diabetic of the year or what. But he ate the ice cream sundae only because he had the French fries. He would eat a French fry, do a bite of sundae. Eat a French fry, eat a bite of sundae. And what that does is it bypasses the neuroregulation of appetite, the brain's ability to sense, have we eaten enough of any given item? And because they were able to juxtapose these flavors in such a dramatic way, then he was able to overwrite basically the programming in his brain that would normally say, not only is that it, but will actually make you vomit, if you continue to eat more. And this is our modern food environment. You go to a restaurant, you go to a convenience store, I think the average supermarket has 55,000 food-like items in it, and there's 8 to 12,000 new food type items that are developed every year. And again, these folks are actually very savvy with evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, the neuroregulation of appetite, and they use this material to better engineer their foods. Whereas in kind of the mainstream medical circles trying to talk about the neuroregulation of appetite, people look at you like you have 3 heads. Like, what on earth are you talking about? Just eat less. You're just lazy. You need better self-control. But if that narrative isn't true, if it's not about self-control, if it's not about being lazy, if it's a basic biological feature that humans are designed to eat as much as they possibly can because we came from a resource-scarce environment, and now we're in this resource-rich environment with an infinite variety of flavors, then we need a really different strategy to deal with that than just saying, hey, eat less, move more. And this is where the research that I really like, there was a Diet Fit study where they looked at folks that were instructed how to eat a whole food, low-fat diet, a whole food, low-carb diet. Both groups did about as well. Both of them lost weight. Both of them improved. They had high protein and equal protein in both groups. Both groups in aggregate did well. Within both of those groups, some people did very poorly, which speaks to the individualization. Some people do better on high carb. Some people do better on low carb. But the thing that will guarantee failure is being in this middle ground where we're trying to have kind of high carb and kind of high fat all at the same time. And so from my perspective, people kind of need to pick one path or the other. Either go low carb or go low fat and mainly stick in that lane for the most part. If you eat 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, that's 21 meals. 18 to 19 of those meals should be in the lane you picked, and 2 of them are kind of optional beyond that. And I think if you do much more deviation than that, you're really asking for a lot of problems.
It's so interesting, just the way that our diet is set up today is so much. It's a lot of sweet foods typically. And, most people eat today to sort of satisfy their sweet tooth. But one of the things, I know you and I share this common passion. It made me think about this because you were talking about eating the French fries, eating the ice cream. But this is kind of like a common meal today. When people are eating meals, it's like meat, starch, something sweet. I mean, that's someone's average dinner. I'm just thinking back. I was reading something recent. They were talking about the energetics of food. And they were talking about an Ayurvedic medicine, Asian medicine, not just food as medicine. They looked at the entire meal and how to make it a medicine. And I thought this was cool. Like if you look at something like sushi, sushi is cooling foods plus warming foods. It's like, why when you eat sushi is there seaweed and raw fish, which is super cooling, but then you have wasabi and ginger, which are really warming because they balance each other out. If you were just having one, you'd have irritable bowel syndrome after a certain amount of time. If you had the other, you'd have chronic inflammation, high blood pressure. And so anyways, it's, what they really thought about during these ancient times. And I know you've studied so much, paleo and regenerative agriculture and these other civilizations that have lived long periods of time. They really thought about their food as how to make these meals as medicine. No one does that today. You look at Ayurveda and Chinese medicine, the meals were kind of created by a physician. Right. Now it's food companies and others who are dictating so much of it. But that was another topic I did want to touch on, is I know that you really have done some good research on regenerative agriculture. And unfortunately today, we've got companies like Monsanto, big agricultural companies who are totally destroying, the carbon levels and all the things happening in our soil. And I'm really close to this. Myself and my business partner, Jordan Rubin, we own 5,000 acres in Missouri and 1,000 acres in Tennessee, where we do permaculture and silvopasture, and we have a hemp farm in Tennessee as well. So we are really in tune with regenerative agriculture. But I'd love to hear your thoughts and take on really the power of regenerative agriculture and how it applies to everybody listening today.
Yeah, there are examples of different food production systems that are several thousand years old. Places in Central America, South America, Scottish Highlands. There are places where we've seen the agricultural approaches destroy the area. Like the Fertile Crescent used to be fertile, and now it's a desert. And so there was some mismanagement there. And unfortunately, there's probably more examples of poor management than good, but there are some examples of well-managed areas that the food systems are largely the same now as what they were 3, 4, 5,000 years ago. Like they're qualitatively the same. And what's interesting is they really have an eye towards what are the needs and the opportunities of that specific landscape. The needs of someone in Central Mongolia are going to be totally different than like Central America, and what we've motored towards with the industrialization of our food system is, again, like a one size fits all for everybody. And Diana Rogers and I are writing a book and doing a movie called Sacred Cow, which really digs into the health, environmental, and ethical considerations for better meat. And it's a very unpopular topic right now, because the things that you bring up, like the notion that grazing animals might actually be beneficial for climate change, is a really hot topic. Like, you now can't even have a conversation. Suggesting that will oftentimes get one labeled as a climate change denier. And you're like, whoa. No, I get greenhouse effect, like gases trap energy, raises temperature. No debate on that. Let's talk about how, different strategies of dealing with that. And so it's a really controversial topic, but this basic idea of regenerative agriculture is using plants, animals, and the natural environment in a way that it could go on in perpetuity, like until the sun runs out of hydrogen to fuse. Like, this process could continue going on, whereas our current row crop food system is entirely dependent on synthetic fertilizers, a host of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. And we know that these things are causing ever larger problems, like huge dead zones in the ocean, estuary areas where major waterways empty into oceans because of the nitrogenous waste. And so not only is it damaging the soil, not only is it not sequestering carbon and reducing the heat footprint, which well-managed regenerative agriculture could do all of that stuff, it's also damaging the oceans themselves. So,
I'd love to hear. So my wife and I we have a place we vacation on in the panhandle of Florida. It's called Santa Rosa Beach, or 30A, Seaside Watercolor. So it's a place we go there and I plug all the time. Last year they had red tide so bad that literally, thousands upon thousands of fish were dead. And I started reading up on this online, and of course now Google has buried it so far it's hard to find. But they were talking about all of these chemicals running off, especially in the Everglades where they grow a lot of sugar cane. That's going out in the ocean. The ocean's natural way of dealing with it is with algae. But now this is moving up into Sarasota, Tampa, up through the Gulf Coast of Florida, and literally people, you can't go outside. You kind of choke. It's hard to breathe. Like, people are thinking about moving out. So anyways, I just wanted to say this hits really close to home to a lot of people. Like, I've even seen that in us taking vacations.
Right. Yeah. And the crazy thing is the kind of dominant narrative right now is just supporting a couple of companies that basically own the intellectual rights on virtually all the food that's being produced. Whereas the counterpoint to this is a zillion small, decentralized, family-owned farms that deal with the challenges and the opportunities in a specific local environment. Like, we just recorded our podcast earlier, and one of the news topics that I pulled up was a Mother Jones piece. I'll actually snag it here real quick, but it was talking about these two brothers that own a pig farming operation in New Mexico, and all of the feed that they use for the pigs comes from local restaurants, supermarkets, basically food that's a little bit outside expiration date, but just these two brothers that have a 40-acre pig farm, they reduce the landfill inputs by 80,000 pounds a week, just with the activity that they do. And there's estimates that about 50% of the food that's produced in westernized countries ends up getting landfilled. And so this is another piece of this whole, kind of biodynamic story. If you go almost anywhere else in the world, food waste and other types of waste get put back into animals like chickens and pigs and ducks and even certain types of fish to upcycle the nutrients. And then we end up not in the scenario of red tide because all this nutrient effluent ends up out in the ocean. So the bugger with it is that no one person can own all the IP on it. There's lots of different solutions. It becomes very regional. We have lots of laws ranging from homeowners associations to zoning that make things like this really difficult to enact. But if folks are concerned about climate change and food quality, these are the places that we actually have an amazing amount of opportunity to change kind of legal status at the local level to make it more amenable for people to have small decentralized farms and to do things like pulling food out of overripe fruit and different foods out of supermarkets and make that actually legal to happen.
It's crazy how difficult it is to create healthy change sometimes. It's insane. So switching gears here, I would love to talk a little bit about, just for our viewers here. So if we have, what do you think are your biggest, so we've talked a little about paleo, we've talked about keto, but generally speaking, what are some of the biggest game changers that you think that the average person needs to start being aware of for their own health? I mean, is there something dietarily? Is there a mindset? Is it stress? Is there sleep? Like, I'd love to hear from you what you think. What are 3 needle movers if someone says, I want to feel really different 30 days from now? What are some things they can do?
So I think the biggest one that is most overlooked, although it's changing, is probably sleep. We have this kind of Puritan work ethic. Sleep is for the weak. I'll sleep when I'm dead. And it's just crystal clear that we are sleeping less than we have historically, even like 20 years ago. And the likely health consequences are pretty dramatic, to say nothing of just like huge numbers of accidents and injuries that occur because people are driving and operating machinery and doing things when they're as impaired as if they had been drinking. So that sleep piece is enormous, and it should be as easy as selling sex, but it's a hard sell to get people to turn off their social media, to put down their devices, to put on some blue blockers in the evening, dim the lights in their house, and to go to bed a little bit earlier and practice a little bit of sleep hygiene. But where and when I've been able to get people to do that, it's amazing. The flip side of that is folks who must live in a disordered circadian rhythm, police, military, fire, new parents. They experience the downside of disordered sleep. It's virtually impossible to lose body fat. No matter how tight you are on your diet, what exercise you do, you're not at particularly great body composition typically. So it's a really good illustration of how challenging all that stuff is. And, I guess on the food side, encouraging people to just tinker a little bit with, do you do better low carb? Do you do better high carb? Do a little bit of testing with that. And even within that story, some people will find that they don't do well with rice, but they do great with potatoes. So it's not necessarily a deal that they are better off low carb, but they may be better with yams and sweet potatoes and white potatoes than they are with quinoa, corn, and rice. And so doing a little bit of experimentation, I have a thing, if folks do a little searching, Robb Wolf 7-day carb test, they can get a free download on like how to test their blood sugar and figure out what foods that they do well with. And so sleep, carb testing, I guess just general, like being out in the day as much as possible, that circadian biology, which wraps back around with the sleep, but we tend to be indoors far too much for what's healthy for us. We tend to not get the intense light during the day, but then we have too much light exposure in the evening, and it tends to disorder our circadian biology. And that whole topic is fascinating. Like, they're finding that a number of drugs like chemotherapy may be far more effective if it's done in the morning versus the evening. And that may be due to circadian biology considerations. So that circadian clock story is just going to be enormous as we go forward. And there's so much to learn about that.
It's so interesting too. Again, my mind just goes to Chinese medicine. If you've seen the body clock and what organs are really the most blood flow is getting to at what times of the day, it's just so fascinating.
Yeah. And it's interesting. The reductionist approach of Western medicine has been really amazing in some regards, but it's so parts and pieces that we're now at a spot where the parts and pieces approach isn't going to deal with cancer or diabetes or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. I think two of the largest drug companies in the world just abandoned their Alzheimer's drug research because it's a metabolically driven process, and you're just not, and I'm like the most optimistic guy in the world, but you're not going to address a process that is that complex with a single magic bullet. It's just not going to happen. And even these folks kind of recognize that we need a multifactorial approach that addresses sleep and food and circadian biology and community and support. And those things are non-negotiable features. If you're missing one of those, we have to figure out a way of propping that up if we're going to kick the can on these disease processes or maybe even reverse them.
Yeah, it's so good. Well, I want to say, Robb, thanks so much for coming on the show. I do want to give a few shout outs to things you got going on. Number one, hey, if you want to listen to a great podcast, make sure to check out Robb's podcast. It's the Healthy Rebellion Radio. You can find it there on iTunes. Also, Dr. Robb has written some awesome books. You can find them in bookstores nationwide, Amazon.com. But again, especially telling you, his podcast is awesome. It's the Healthy Rebellion, or it's Healthy Rebellion Radio. Make sure to check it out. I want to say, Robb, thanks so much for what you do for, again, bringing research to the forefront, being a pioneer in keto and in paleo, and again, just respect your work. So thanks so much.
Huge honor, Doc. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Robb. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
This podcast is for information purposes only. Statements and views expressed in this podcast are not medical advice and have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. In some cases, individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein.